Stephen. Before we get started, with a show of hands, who has ever been on a compost bedded pack? Okay, good. So for this talk, we'll start with what compost bedded packs are. We'll go over some composting basics, which are key to managing the system properly. And then we'll talk about our University of Guelph project, where we have 4 studies that comprise that. And we'll touch on a collaboration we have going on with Giselle LaPointe's lab in the Department of Food Science. Compost bedded packs are a type of loose housing system that were first developed in the 1980s in the US with the aim of increasing cow comfort and longevity, and at that time, lowering initial barn building costs. The resting area and exercise area is completely open, and it's made up of a mixture of cow manure and organic bedding substrate. These systems are actively managed, and they are not straw packs. Traditional bedded packs are bedded daily, usually with straw, and they're cleaned out every 4 to 6 weeks, and they undergo anaerobic fermentation, meaning they do not require oxygen. In contrast, compost bedded packs are tilled or cultivated usually twice a day, and they're bedded often with sawdust. They're cleaned out once to twice per year, depending on producer preferences and the rate of composting, and they undergo aerobic composting, meaning they require oxygen. These systems have the potential to improve animal welfare, and this is of particular interest because animal welfare is part of the social license for having dairy farms and agriculture. Fewer injuries have been reported in these systems, like hawk injuries, and that makes sense because the surface of the pack is non-abrasive. Packs that are well managed give cows a soft and dry area to stand, and less lameness has been reported in these systems by some studies. Because there are no stalls and the area is completely open, it allows for natural behavior. For example, cows can lie down in all positions, like this cow in the bottom here. She's completely spread out. They can also socialize, and they can exhibit heats on solid, non-slippery flooring. In order for compost bedded packs to be clean and dry, they rely on proper management and effective composting. So this includes bedding material, such as sawdust. Bedding material is needed because it's high in carbon content and to absorb moisture. Manure is provided from the cows, and that's high in nitrogen and moisture, and oxygen is needed for the composting process. These are mixed together and composting will occur. It requires adequate levels of moisture, a ratio of carbon to nitrogen, temperature, and of course it requires oxygen and pH levels. During the composting process, moisture is released from the pack, CO2 is released, and so is heat. And the heat released is related to microbial activity, so that is one of the indicators we can use when measuring composting. The materials can be used as solid fertilizer or solid manure on fields. Producers may take it directly from the barn and apply it to fields, or they could further compost it to increase quality. This is an example of pack management where they're aerating the pack using a rototiller. The function of this is to mix in manure that's on the surface of the pack, add in oxygen, and release moisture. And you can see behind here, moisture is evaporating from the pack surface. And I'm going to emphasize moisture management, with this picture being one of them. It's a picture taken directly after the rototiller has passed over the pack, and you can see the moisture evaporating from the surface. Composting releases moisture, and we get it out of the pack, and it's also important to get that moisture out of the barn. Adding bedding is another management practice. Again, that's to supply carbon to fuel the microbes that compost and to absorb moisture. The success of these systems depend on management, but there's limited data that exists for Ontario compost bedded packs. So this led to the University of Guelph compost bedded pack project, which also had preliminary work from OMAFA that collected data that led to the generation of this project. We have collaborators from across the University of Guelph and outside of the University of Guelph, including Dr. Dave Kelton, Dr. Derek Haley, and Dr. Giselle Lapointe in the University of Guelph. Dr. Gordon Price is from Dalhousie, Dr. Rob Gordon is from the University of Windsor, and then Dr. Tom Wright and Christophe Wand are from OMAFA. The overall aim of this project is to develop best management practices for the productivity, health, and welfare of cattle in Ontario and Canadian compost-bedded pack housing systems. So we have 4 studies in this project. The main one is number 1, where we looked at management, pack conditions, milk quality, and animal welfare measures. And then the other 3 stemmed from that. And also one of the goals was to characterize management practices. So how are Ontario producers managing their packs? Study 1 looked at the associations between management, pack conditions, milk quality, and animal-based measures. We had 25 commercial compost-bedded pack farms in southern Ontario within about 2.5 hours from the University of Guelph. The numbers in the circles show the number of farms in each county. Our herds were small to medium size with an average of 83 cows, lactating cows on the pack, and ranged from 22 to 240. We visited each farm 6 times over the course of 1 year, with visits spaced about 2 months apart, and that allowed us to capture seasonal variation. To touch on some highlights from the pack condition measurements we took, as expected, there was seasonal variation in the pack conditions. In the summer, packs were drier and had lower moisture content. During the shoulder months, so fall, spring, and winter, there's more precipitation, cooler temperatures, and less air movement throughout the barn, so we had lower temperatures and higher moisture content. These 3 samples show differences in a pack that one might expect. So I know it might be hard to see from the back. There are 3 tins. The first one is darker in color, meaning more moisture content, and there are some larger clumps. They were taken 2 months apart from the same farm, and the third one on the right was the driest. And within these 3 samples from the same farm, over 6 months, there was almost 20% difference in moisture content. In terms of management practices associated with pack conditions, one of them was the depth of aeration. So that video I showed with the rototiller, that's how deep they're working the pack. Packs that were tilled deeper than 12 inches had higher temperatures than packs that were tilled shallower than 10 inches. And as temperature is one of the indicators we can use for composting, this suggests that the deeper tilling improved composting. And Kendra will touch on that as well. Bedding type was associated with the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the pack, and carbon is required for fuel. The packs using sawdust had higher carbon content or carbon to nitrogen ratio than those using MDF. MDF stands for medium density fiberboard, and it's basically ground up IKEA furniture. It absorbs moisture well, and the packs can look good, but it does have a low carbon content and is not ideal for composting. So sawdust provides more fuel for microbes. In terms of milk quality, the somatic cell count over the average of the study was 152,500. These were data collected from April 2022 to March 2023. And the data collected was every single bulk tank milk pickup from our farms. And if we look at this broken down by month, these are the data presented in calendar year. So because we started in April 2022, January, February, March are 2023, and then April starts 2022. In comparison, the provincial average during these same months was about 16,000 higher than the average we had during our study. Our somatic cell count suggests that producers are able to achieve milk quality as defined by somatic cell count, and producers overall are able to manage their somatic cell count. We found that the method of milking prep was associated with bulk tank bacterial counts. And by method of milking prep, I mean either by hand, as in a parlor, or an automatic milking system that uses a brush or a cup. Milking prep by hand or brush had lower bulk tank bacterial counts than those using a cup. And that was the aerobic bacteria and coliform counts. And we found the same for the likelihood of having pathogenic bacterial species in the milk. And of course, fewer bacteria in the milk improves milk quality. At every visit, we scored a subset of the herd for hock, knees, and gait, and we based our sample size off the ProAction scoring system. 99% of the hocks we scored were considered acceptable, or a score of 1 or 2, based on the ProAction scoring system. And we found the same for knees, with 99% considered acceptable. For lameness, 93% of the cows we scored were considered non-lame and able to move freely, and that's a score of 1 to 2 in the NFAC Code of Practice scoring system. These are really good numbers, and it's not surprising for the hocks and knees because the surface of the pack is non-abrasive. And if we translate this into the ProAction scoring system, the cattle assessment report that every farm gets, that means overall, our farms fell in the green zone, where 90% or more of the cows were acceptable for hocks, knees, and mobility scores. We then looked at associations between the environment and pack conditions and cow distribution across the pack during summer. This was Taylor Gordon's major project for her master's, and the rationale for looking at this was we know that composting can generate high temperatures, reported up to 55 degrees Celsius. So we wondered whether there would be spots in the pack that were hot, and cows may choose to avoid being in these spots. And in our conversations with producers, they mentioned concerns about cows bunching under fans in the summer months, and we also observed this during our summer data collection visits. So we had 4 farms that we visited during the summer. They all had these high volume, low speed, or HVLS fans. We divided the packs into sections conceptually, as in there were no physical barriers on the pack, and we used video recording to figure out the number of cows in each section. In each section, we measured wind speed, air temperature, relative humidity above the pack at about 2 meters, and from the pack, we collected samples for moisture and measured temperatures at the surface and 15 centimeters below the surface of the pack. And the variable of interest here was the number of cows per meter squared, basically like a density of cows in areas on the pack. We found that a greater number of cows per meter squared was associated with sections that had higher wind speeds and higher moistures. And sections that were located directly under HVLS fans had significantly higher wind speeds than all other locations, including those next to side curtains. This has implications for management. So if airflow is higher in certain areas of the pack, and cows are seeking air movement to help mitigate with heat stress, for example, this can create an uneven density of cows across the pack. Certain areas may become too wet, like higher moisture content directly under the fans, and other areas that don't have cows may become too dry. And both of those negatively affect composting. It also highlights the importance of airflow across the pack to have an even distribution of cows. And this study had farms that used HVLS fans. So the next step would be to look at other types of ventilation systems used in packs, such as tunnel ventilation, box fans, or the cyclone fans. And now I'll turn it over to Kendra to talk about study 3 and 4.
All right, so I'm Kendra, and I'm going to be discussing the third and fourth study, the third one being management practices, deep versus shallow tilling. So tilling depth was chosen for phase 2 based on an indication of potential benefits from phase 1, as Angie just discussed. So the other thing we did is we ran focus groups with producers to see what barriers may stop them from doing a management practice. Those would be time as well as money. So tilling depth was a feasible change for some producers to make on their farms that they could do relatively quickly without having to invest in equipment. The potential benefits of deeper tilling, we thought, would be that by tilling deeper, we're going to increase the active layer of the pack by providing oxygen to microbes deeper in the pack, so we're going to have more composting going on, as well as we're going to help remove moisture from a deeper part of the pack, reducing overall pack moisture. So this is great because if we're able to manage pack moisture, we can manage bedding costs or reduce bedding costs long term, which is definitely needed as bedding can be quite costly. It can also be hard to source in the winter months when it's needed most. So we had 8 farms enrolled in this study, and our treatments were deep, which is tilling to a depth of 14 to 16 inches deep, and shallow to a depth of 8 to 10 inches deep. And these tilling depths were chosen based off data from phase 1 that Angie had. So we had 4 farms enrolled in each sequence, the sequences being deep, shallow, deep, or shallow, deep, shallow. The producers then tilled for 28 days or 4 weeks at the prescribed tilling depth before they switched. So data was collected at the end of each treatment period, and we collected pack data. This was to analyze the amount of composting going on, so we had collected samples for moisture, temperature, carbon-nitrogen ratio, as well as respiration rate. In terms of animal-based measures, we collected these to assess cow well-being as well as productivity. So we looked at cleanliness, line behavior, as well as milk quality parameters. So overall, in this study, no changes were found between deep versus shallow tilling. That being said, deeper tilling may be needed to apply for a longer period of time, so more than 4 weeks, in order to see a change in pack conditions, which would then be reflected in our animal-based measures. Or it's possible that tilling depth is not effective on its own for managing pack moisture. So then, study 4, describing line behavior. So why would we want to describe line behavior? Well, line behavior is an indicator of cow health and well-being, as sick or injured cows do have altered line behavior. It is also a measure of cow well-being, as cows have a preference for soft and dry surfaces. If they don't have access to soft and dry line surfaces, their line time will decrease. So little is known about the line behavior of dairy cows on compost-bedded packs. However, there is one study out of Minnesota, and they found about an average of 10 hours per day of line time. So for my study, we looked at 14 herds in Ontario. The average herd size was 70 cows, and we measured 20 to 30 cows per farm for 5 consecutive days. So we did find the average herd line duration was 10.8 hours per day, with a minimum herd line time of 8.8 and a maximum of 12.3. So that's this first bar here. The second one here, this is the study out of Minnesota. So they found a slightly lower average, but if we compare the min and the max, our study did find quite a bit higher overall. And then the last bar here, this is all housing types for line behavior. So tie stall, free stall, and pasture. So about an average of 11 hours per day was found. With our 10.8 hours, we are kind of within that expected range for daily line time. So this descriptive study indicates that cows on compost-bedded packs are able to fulfill their line behavior needs, allowing for improved cow comfort and health.
And lastly, we'll mention our collaboration with Dr. Giselle Lapointe's lab. They're looking at evaluating microbial communities on Ontario compost-bedded packs, And our student Victor has a poster in the poster room, so please look at that. So they're looking at compost-bedded pack samples to further study microbiota and biocontrols in these systems. They're combining culture methods with metagenomic sequence analysis to look at the microbial load and the presence of pathogenic species in the pack. And they found a lot of variation in the prevalence of mastitis-related pathogens. So we're working with Armin, Elliot, Victor, and Rasul. And then we're also doing a project where we're modeling the compost-bedded pack environment to study bacterial survivability. And I would like to point out that Victor has done a large amount of work on this and has made this possible. So the purpose of this is to have a model to study bacterial survivability. We developed, piloted, and evaluated a compost-bedded pack model, meaning we did this in a controlled lab setting. We aim to replicate idealized compost-bedded pack conditions, and to our knowledge, this has never been done. So why would we want to do this? Well, a compost-bedded pack for dairy cows is unique for composting compared to other composting systems. Because you have cows continually depositing manure on the pack, you have tractors compacting the pack and reducing oxygen, you're adding bedding frequently, and then you have the changing environment and weather conditions. So by developing a model like this, we're able to test management practices under controlled conditions and to test bacterial survivability. This allows us to do it in a low-risk setting. You can imagine that we can't go out and inoculate a pack with Staph aureus due to the risks for milk quality and animal health. In summary, farmers and everyone working with packs should expect differences in pack condition throughout the year. It's important to have adequate, adaptable, and proactive management for these systems to be successful. And an example of proactive management is if you know there are going to be a few days where it's really wet, add bedding before that. Don't wait until the pack gets too wet. It's more challenging to come back from that. Moisture management is key, which has been a theme throughout our whole presentation. This includes adding enough bedding and bedding of the right type to support composting. So Kendra mentioned that sawdust can be challenging to get in the winter due to supply issues. It's also costly. These systems require much more bedding than what would be used in tie stalls and free stalls. So it's important to know that before choosing a system like this. And along those lines, they also require much more area per cow than free stalls and tie stalls. Ventilation is important, not only for cow distribution across the pack, but also to get moisture out of the barn once it's been released from the pack. And although tilling depth was associated with better pack temperatures in our observational study, when we tested it under controlled conditions, we didn't see a difference. So we're still discussing the reasons for that. And good milk quality is achievable, as suggested by a reasonable somatic cell count scores. And prep method, the teat prep method, functions as a barrier between the pack and bulk tank milk quality. And finally, compost-bedded packs do promote cow comfort as suggested by our positive hock, knee, and gait scores. And in our conversations with producers, they emphasize that in general, they're happy with these systems, particularly with the ability to optimize cow comfort. We'd like to thank the collaborators involved in this project, the funding that came from OMAFA, with contributions from the Dairy Farmers of Ontario and the Quebec dairy producers. We would like to thank our dairy producers involved in the study that let us come to their farms and answer all of our questions. And of course, the students that helped us with data collection.